Welcome to Pillow Time Lore, where dreams take shape and stories wrap around you like your favorite blanket. You've made it through the day, and now it's time to slow down, breathe deeply, and drift into a world made just for you. So, fluff up your pillow, snuggle into your coziest spot, and let your eyes get heavier with each word. This is your moment. No to-do lists, no noise, just stillness and a little magic. With each breath in, feel the tension melt from your shoulders. With each breath out, let go of everything that doesn't serve your peace. You're safe here. Tonight's story is soft and soothing, like a warm cup of tea for your thoughts, carefully crafted to calm your busy mind and help you drift gently into sleep. So close your eyes, dear dreamer. Let your imagination wander while I carry you into a land where anything is possible and everything ends in peace. This is Pillow Time Lore. The rain hadn't stopped for hours, the kind that drummed softly on rooftops and made even neon signs blur into sleepy smudges of light. Raya tugged her coat tighter around her, one hand gripping the handle of her umbrella, the other holding the paper slip she'd been given earlier that day. Haverly Library Night Shift. Report at 9 p.m. sharp. Ask for Mr. Elric. It was almost too quiet when she stepped through the glass doors. Not the eerie kind of silence, no. This was a library silence, warm, respectful, and humming with the energy of secrets well kept. Golden lamps pooled soft light onto velvet rugs. Wooden shelves stretched high, brimming with titles whose spines looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Raya paused at the front desk, uncertain, until she spotted Hemon, elderly man, thin and angular, sitting behind a desk like he'd been carved into it. He had a long nose, silver-rimmed glasses perched at the tip, and a wool cardigan buttoned all the way up. He looked up as if he'd been expecting her all evening. "You must be Miss Raya," he said, his voice low, dusted with accent, punctual. "Good," she gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you for the opportunity." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into the drawer and pulled out a small rectangular card. It shimmered under the warm light gold, with no writing on it except for a tiny emblem in the corner. "An open eye within a book, this," he said, placing it in her palm. "Gives you access to the real library," Raya blinked. I thought this was the library." He smiled faintly, but didn't answer, just turned, slowly, and pointed to a door at the end of the hall. One she hadn't noticed before, old, arched, with brass hinges and a worn handle. It looked like it didn't belong in a building like this, more like a prop from a forgotten fairy tale. "Your shift begins there," he said before she could ask anything else. He stood and began gathering his coat. "I don't stay past 9, he murmured. "The library prefers its own company at night." Then he was gone, his umbrella tapping down the marble steps into the rainy fog outside. Raya stood alone. She looked at the golden card in her hand. It felt warm. Her boots creaked softly as she walked to the arched door. The card slid into the keyhole with an almost magnetic pull, and with a low, satisfying click, it opened behind. It was a hallway bathed in amber light, lined with shelves that curved inward like the belly of a whale. Everything smelled like cinnamon and old ink and something else, something unnameable. Door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in years, Raya felt a strange, quiet pull in her chest, like something or someone had been waiting for her. The brass-handled door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving Raya cocooned. The hallway from the previous night branched into something entirely new, now a wide rotunda with domed ceilings, twinkling with tiny fairy lights like stars. Shelves spiraled from floor to ceiling, ladders perched like sleepy sentinels. Time here felt thick, like honey, slow and warm. Her little desk sat by the window, where a single glowing lamp waited, already on. A journal with a fountain pen rested beside it. She hadn't written in it yet. She didn't even know what to write. So she wandered. The library felt alive tonight, not in a creepy way, no more like it was watching gently, like a cat curled on a windowsill with one eye open. She passed a section labeled obsolete maps of cities that didn't exist. Another corner was filled with music boxes. One opened as she passed, playing a tune she didn't know but somehow recognized. She turned. There was no one there. Raya smiled a little. "Okay, we're doing this," she whispered to herself. The hours passed gently. She reshelved a few stray books, read the first page of an ancient novel about dreaming statues, and even brewed herself some tea. From the little kitchenette tucked behind the philosophical puzzles section. But the library began to shift at midnight. At first, it was small, a book that thudded gently to the floor just as she turned the corner. A draft of air, despite closed windows, the faint scent of honey, and something older like sandalwood. Then the lamp on her desk began to flicker. Only when she passed, it steadied when she sat down, fluttered again when she stood up. She spoke to it, eventually. "Am I annoying you?" The lamp blinked twice. She stared at it. Okay. The clock struck 3 a.m. And that's when she heard it, typing, soft, slow, purposeful, typing, click-clack, click-clack. The sound came from the archive room, down a narrow hallway, guarded by a velvet rope that she had been told not to cross until her third shift. But the typing didn't care about rules. Raya tiptoed toward it, bare feet on velvet rugs. Click-clack, pause, click-clack. She pushed open the door, holding her breath. The archive room was empty. Books sat untouched, papers in neat stacks, and an antique typewriter rested on a desk near the far wallet's keys, still swaying slightly as if just used. She stepped closer. The paper in the machine had a single line typed in it. "You made it." Raya's breath caught. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She didn't type anything, not yet. Instead, she turned around slowly. The room was quiet again, still, watching. Raya whispered to the shelves, "Guess we're not alone." After all, behind her, the typewriter gave a tiny ding, and somewhere in the library, a clock struck 3:04. He came every night, always in the same gray coat, always at 3:17 a.m., and always to the same seat in the far right corner of the library. Raya noticed him on her third shift, not because he was unusual, but because he never looked up, never spoke, just read. The book in his hands was thick and bound in deep navy blue. No title on the spine, but when Raya passed by the next night, the book was red, and the next, black, different every time, but always the same man, always the same seat, always silent. She never interrupted. It felt like she wasn't supposed to, until one night, he didn't come. His chair sat empty, but the book was there left behind neatly, as if waiting. This time, it had a title, "To Whom It May Concern," heart thudding. Raya opened it. Inside weren't pages of story or notes, but letters, dozens of them, folded neatly, addressed carefully, all to her, all dated 10 years in the future, and all signed the same way. From someone who knew you'd make it. She flipped to the first one. It read, "You're braver than you think, but not yet as brave as you'll become." Raya looked toward the chair. It was still warm. Raya couldn't sleep the next day. The letters haunted her, not with fear, but with a strange familiarity, like they were meant to find her. Back at the library that night, she noticed something new. A narrow corridor near the archives, one she could have sworn didn't exist before, led to a small locked door marked Shelf B7. She'd passed it a dozen times. It was always locked, but tonight, a strange tug of instinct made her pull open the bottom drawer of the nearby desk. Taped behind the drawer was an old brass key. Her hands trembled as she turned it in the lock. The room beyond was silent and dimly golden, like the light had aged with the books. Dust hung in the air, unmoving, no windows, just rows, and rows of shelves, each filled with books that had no publishers, no authors. She reached for one. The cover was blank, the pages weren't. The stories inside were vivid, written in clean type. A sci-fi novel set in 2041. A political thriller about a man who hadn't yet become president. A memoir titled "I'm Still Not Sorry," dated 2035. Books that hadn't been written yet. Her heart pounded as she scanned titles, and then she saw it, the girl in the library. By no one, she opened it. The first page began with, "Raya took the job on a Wednesday." It was raining. Every detail of her life, every late-night thought, her dreams, her doubts, her growing obsession with the strange letters. Everything up to now. She flipped faster. Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 7. Her breath caught. Chapter 9. The end. There was no Chapter 10, just a blank page, and a handwritten note scrawled at the bottom. The rest is unwritten, but not for long. Raya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by eyes, but by stories themselves. After reading The Girl in the Library, her nights shifted. The whispers between shelves felt louder, the silence heavier. She returned to shelf B7 the next evening, hoping to reread that final note, but the book was gone. In its place was a sticky note taped to the shelf. Check the logs. Logs. She searched behind the desk again and found a drawer she hadn't noticed before. Inside, a dusty, old computer, no password, just a flickering blue screen and a folder titled Night Shift Backup Logs. She clicked it open. There were 10 audio files, each marked with a date, each from a different year, each from a different librarian. She put on the headphones and listened. The first voice was cheerful. "Hey, so I'm recording this for fun. My first night. This place is a dream." Second, "Okay, books are weirdly rearranging themselves, but it's probably just catalog glitches." By the 5th entry, I saw a shadow in the poetry aisle. It whispered my name. By the 7th, something's mimicking my voice. By the 9th, silence, a long, raspy breath. Then they watch. When you read your book, it writes faster when you know, finally. The 10th, barely audible, just static and broken breathing. Then one sentence, clear as day. "If you're hearing this, don't read your book, Raya." Slowly took the headphones off, but she already had, and the book had already started writing chapter 10. After the logs, Raya couldn't sleep even during the day. Her apartment felt hollow, and the library, it had started feeling like it knew she had listened. On her 7th night, the hallway lights flickered in a rhythmic pattern, almost like a trail. Curiosity tugged harder than fear now. She followed, at the farthest end of the west wing. A rusted brass handle, a door she swore had never been there. It creaked open into a room bathed in bluish moonlight, though there were no windows not on the walls. Instead, dozens of old wooden window frames floated in the air, suspended, unmoving, like paintings in a gallery of impossible things. Each frame held a moving memory, vivid and alive. She stepped closer. One showed a child playing piano in a sunlit attic. Another, an old man laughing with someone who looked just like him. Raya felt her breath catch in her throat. These weren't her memories. She moved from frame to frame, each one telling someone's personal story. Some filled her chest with warmth. Others left her heart pounding. Arguments, accidents, a hospital corridor where someone never came. Back then, one frame glowed slightly golden. She stepped toward it cautiously and froze. It was her mother, smiling, stirring something in the kitchen. Humming a tune Raya had forgotten, she remembered. The room felt exactly as it had once smelled, like cardamom and vanilla and sunlight through curtains. Raya placed her hand on the glass. Her mother turned and smiled. Then the frame shimmered and cracked. The moment vanished. Raya stumbled back. The remaining frames began to hum softly, almost like they were waiting to be watched, or warning her. She turned to leave, but before the door closed, she saw it. One frame in the corner, still glowing. Her name was written under it. Raya, final night. She hadn't seen that before, and she hadn't created that memory yet. The next night, Raya avoided the window room, but something followed her. A faint drip, then another. She glanced down. Thick, black ink was seeping from a crack in the marble floor slow, like oil. It wasn't there before. She followed it, her footsteps silent in the vast hush of the library. The trail curved past the archives and ended in a forgotten corner, where a small trapdoor hid beneath a rug. She hesitated, then opened it. The air inside was warm and wrong. She climbed down into a dusty crawlspace, lit only by her flashlight. Burnt paper crumbled beneath her shoes. Shelves lined the walls, filled with half-burnt manuscripts, some still smoldering at the edges. Then she saw a box. Inside, crossed-out ID cards, old photos of former night librarians, all with their faces scratched out, and at the very bottom, her own picture, scratched out too. The ink puddle above began to drip louder. She backed away, and that's when she noticed something. Scrawled on the wall, over and over, in hurried black ink, "It's not your story to finish." By the 8th night, something was off. Again, Raya sat behind the desk, half asleep, until the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in gray coat, same as always, and gave her a nod. He wandered off toward his usual corner. A moment later, the bell chimed again. The same man walked in. Raya blinked. He passed her without a word. Again, the bell chimed a third time. Same coat, same footsteps, same man. She stood, pulse ticking faster from her spot. She watched the library as if watching a stage glitch near the reading area. A girl placed a book on the return shelf. Seconds later, the same girl returned to return it again, then again, in the archives. Muffled voices echoed. Raya moved closer, but they looped. "Can you check this out?" And sure, one moment, repeating in exactly the same tone, rhythm, pitch, like a scratched record. Books rearranged themselves backward on the shelves. Pages flipped in reverse. The clock over the entrance spun. At 3:03 a.m., it reset. 2:58 a.m. Raya gripped her chair. The computers rebooted. Her last login vanished. So did last night's entries. And then, quietly, one of the lights above her flickered and went off. It stayed that way. She ran toward the archives, hoping the audio logs might explain what was happening. They were gone, just static. She checked the photo box again. This time, her picture wasn't there at all. In its place was a note in faded ink. "You were never here." Her name tag vanished from her sweater, and when she turned to the mirror near the stairwell, there was no reflection, just empty space. Wasn't just collapsing, it was rewriting itself. She hadn't meant to, but on the 9th night, as the library flickered between moments and memories, as time unwound and rewound, and the silence grew, to loud Raya opened the book. always been there, though she had shoved it under a stack of old encyclopedias days ago. Her hands trembled as she turned to the final chapter, and there it was. She chose to stay. The library chose her back. That was it. The rest of the book was blank. She flipped pages. Nothing, just smooth, thick parchment that felt too warm under her fingers. Like it remembered being read. Her breath caught in her throat. The lights dimmed. The desk lamp blinked once, twice, and then glowed steadily from somewhere deep in the library. A whisper curled through the air. Now you know. Something had been waiting. Not watching, not anymore. Waiting. Raya stood, the book still in her hand, the shelves around her felt closer than before. Like they'd leaned in, a low hum buzzed beneath her feet. She didn't feel afraid, not this time. She walked toward shelf B7, and this time, the locked gate was already open as she stepped inside. Card on the desk shimmered gold before vanishing in a blink. She was no longer the librarian, she was the story, and the final page was still being written. The pen wasn't there before. It sat where the book had been placed every night on the oak desk, beside the now faded golden card, heavy, dark, waiting. Raya sat down, hands calm for the first time in 10 nights. She opened the final page of The Girl in the Library, blank. She didn't hesitate. In slow, steady strokes, she wrote. She stayed until she understood, and then she left not because she escaped, but because she chose to begin again as the final word. Dried, the library exhaled. The lights flickered once, then glowed soft and warm. Somewhere far off, a clock chimed 3:03 a.m. For the first time, it didn't echo. She stood. Books remained silent on their shelves. The typing in the archive was gone. The floating windows had stilled, and the door, the one she'd always found locked at dawn, was now cracked open. Fog drifted beyond it, like a veil lifting from a dream. Raya walked through. The night air outside was cool and gentle. The stars above, unfamiliar, not because they had changed, but because she had. Behind her, the library stood quiet, no longer haunted, no longer waiting, and in her book, one new sentence had appeared beneath her own. Some endings aren't escapes, they're arrivals. She smiled, and this time it stayed.